Welcome, and it's maybe an intimate gathering, but it's got the largest age range of any meeting that I've been to since I used to take my son to union meetings. Okay, around our planet there's a growing struggle against fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and incineration, and for climate justice. I'm a member of the Vancouver Eco-Socialists and Broke. Both are part of that struggle. So our first question asks, what needs to be won in this struggle to make the future more livable, socially just, and ecologically sane? I know there's Site C, there's oceans, there's forests, and all the other planetary breaches and environmental struggles, but I only have 15 minutes. So I will focus on fossil fuels for this first part, and I'll get back to the wider picture when I deal with the second question. The climate justice movement, the fossil fuel part, has three overall aims. First, to halt and reverse climate-changing greenhouse gas emissions. Second, to minimize and eliminate other environmental and human health hazards due to the extraction, transportation, and combustion of fossil fuels. And third, to shift the personal, social, and economic costs resulting from such emissions and such hazards away from those who are both least responsible and least able to carry these costs, and over to those who are both most responsible and most able to carry the costs. These three goals are a good partial answer to the first question, what do we need to win? But let's take a closer look. To accomplish these aims, the primary tactics have been, one, blockadia, which we're seeing again this week at Burnaby Mountain, saw 4 years ago, and saw last year at Standing Rock in North Dakota. Two, litigation, centered primarily on First Nations constitutional rights these days, and the lack of due process by government and regulators. Three, electing more sympathetic governments municipally, provincially, and federally, and then keeping pressure on them through mass rallies and lobbying. Four, emphasizing the opposition of First Nations and their legitimacy as age-old occupiers and stewards of the land, rivers, lakes, and seacoast. Five, attempting through all of these and other means to undermine investor confidence in various projects. And six, backing up these five main tactics with impressive efforts to educate, mobilize the public through meetings, social media, use as much as possible of the mainstream media, videos, books, magazine articles, etc. Clearly, these efforts have had some successes. Blockadia efforts on Burnaby Mountain 4 years ago, and hopefully again today, have helped create a situation in Burnaby where over 70% of the population are opposed to expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, marine terminal, and tank farm. Litigation played a large role in killing the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway Dilbit pipeline from the tar sands to Kitimat. Obama's rejection of the U.S. part of the Keystone XL pipeline definitely seemed to validate the electoral tactic. And Trudeau's political maneuvers seem to have stopped the Energy East pipeline, at least for now. First Nations efforts to build opposition to Kinder Morgan started off slowly but have been having a growing impact, especially in the case of the Tsleil-Waututh, through their constant and consistent messaging, court filings, and increasingly frequent events demonstrating unity among many nations. The recently erected Tsleil-Waututh Watch House on Burnaby Mountain, a stone's throw from the Kinder Morgan Burnaby Mountain tank field, is now a focal point of protest. Investor confidence? Even occasional skimming of financial news articles and blogs shows that many potential and actual investors in Kinder Morgan's expansion project are indeed having their confidence shaken. And public education success was definitely demonstrated by the 10,000 people marching in Burnaby 12 days ago. In terms of the first question I'm supposed to be dealing with, this struggle locally and internationally definitely contributes to the increased likelihood of a more livable, socially just, and ecologically harmonious future. But are these partial pluses enough to ensure that future? Because we have to admit we've seen some limitations to these tactics. Standing Rock's land and water protectors, despite incredible mobilization, endurance, and bravery, were defeated by police and troops. Canada's own Natural Resources Minister, Jim Carr, has threatened to use military force against anti-KM protesters. Judicially, several important, even precedent-setting court rulings have been in our favor. Others have not. And the ones we've won have been mostly due, in my assessment, to sloppy government procedural practices. If government smartens up, will we continue to win in court? Decisions are expected within weeks from the Federal Court of Appeal after it heard multiple challenges in Vancouver last October to Trudeau's approval of the Kinder Morgan expansion project. What about electing greener candidates? Obama rejected Keystone, Trump approved it. Harper approved Northern Gateway, Trudeau rejected it. Apparently, government approvals and disapprovals are impermanent. What is dead now may come to life again. They also lack consistency. Obama, the killer of the pipeline, set records for approving offshore drilling. Our latest eco-political savior, BC's NDP Premier John Horgan, is sort of fighting Kinder Morgan, but many count as betrayals his Site C approval and his recently revealed 6-week advance notice to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that the province's scientific public inquiry into fracking would not deal with either GHG emissions or human health dangers. Don't get me wrong, we do need to elect more progressive governments, but we might have to start one step earlier by creating a more consistently progressive party. As for First Nations opposition to KM, it remains strong. It is even becoming stronger. Although the Musqueam pulled out of federal court of appeal hearings last October to pursue other options, and Ottawa's political pressures and corporate bribery overtures to some very poor communities continue unabated. Investor confidence, like the confidence of all gamblers, is changeable and very difficult to control. Government subsidies, political support, and potential repressive measures against protesters might take a lot of the gamble out of gambling on pipeline projects. And while ongoing public education about and public support for our protests should give us a boost, we have to recognize that neither Canada as a whole, nor even BC as a whole, are the same animals as the city of Burnaby. Almost 50% of Canadians buy the Trudeau-Notley bafflegab about jobs, national interests, and balancing fictional plans for greenhouse gas emission reductions with increases in dilbit extraction. Only 1/3 oppose this nonsense. In BC, the latest poll shows firm support for and firm opposition against Kinder Morgan about equal at a bit less than 1/4 of the population each, with over 1/3 of the population seeing merit in both sides and fully 1 out of 5 people having no opinion. Giving us even more pause, if we go back to the original list of the climate justice movement's 3 main goals, can we say that defeating the Kinder Morgan project will reduce planetary greenhouse gas emissions, minimize other global environmental and health harms, or make more equitable either the harms caused by fossil fuels or the cost of remedying those harms? No, we can't. Stopping the Kinder Morgan expansion is necessary, but not sufficient. Shutting down the existing Kinder Morgan pipeline is necessary, but not sufficient, as is the halting of coal shipments from the Port of Vancouver, North America's largest coal exporter. There are many such struggles around the world, but we simply don't have the time, as Anne pointed out in her introductory remarks, to win sequential years-long battles, one here and one there. So what is sufficient, and why bother with things that are not sufficient? What makes them necessary? Well, they're very necessary to building a movement. 2 things are necessary to bring large numbers of people into concerted political action: the knowledge that they are threatened and the belief that they can do something about it. The second prerequisite is helped tremendously by a growing movement. In the past 6 years, since I've been active in the movement, people who understand that climate change is a very serious problem have grown from a small number to a majority. A smaller but significant percentage suspects or believes that profit-driven capitalism, and here I'm also echoing Anne, with its innate requirement for ceaseless growth and its blindness to human and environmental costs, is a prime cause of this problem. With a growing and ever more activist movement, those percentages can be expected to increase. Yet only a much smaller part of the movement is aware that we have still not come up with an effective strategy to win this struggle, to accomplish the 3 aims I noted at the beginning of my remarks. Back to what is a sufficient question, or back to the question of what is sufficient. Because it's convenient and requires little or no disruption in our lives, most people would like to believe that the problem is being handled by the Paris Climate Accord, by the, thanks to Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, not quite pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, or by other so-called climate plans put forward by various governments and political parties. These schemes, these climate plans all depend on some combination of a shift to renewables governed by market forces, i.e. profits, light government regulation, i.e. carbon tax, and technological innovation, i.e. dangerous nukes, maybe more dangerous geoengineering, and unproven carbon capture and sequestration technology. Oh, and then there's the baffle gab. Trudeau's financing of green future by building more pipelines. Rachel Notley's hard cap on oil patch emissions by allowing only a 50% increase of emissions at tar sands extraction sites, and an even larger increase of emissions from exported oil upgraded, refined, and burned around the world. What all these plans have in common is that they are eco-suicidally inadequate. Relying on them will accelerate and worsen the climate disaster that is already unfolding around the world. But what's useful about these plans is that they show politicians' awareness that people want solutions. So that's one of the things that we can say we have to win in order to have a future, a real plan, a global plan with real solutions. What would such a climate plan look like? To ensure it was equitable, it would first of all have to be democratic, made by some sort of a constituent assembly process. It would have to deal with far more than fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and incineration. Emerging renewable energies and energy storage technologies would have to be re-examined, looking at all the environmental pluses and minuses, which, from what I've been reading, is not exactly what we're getting right now. The plan would have to deal with the climate change's existing and predictable extreme weather events, ice storms, wildfires, droughts, and famines. It would have to pay attention to all those other planetary breaches, ocean acidification, deforestation, soil exhaustion, lack of fresh water, those other environmental emergencies I set aside earlier. Social spending on healthcare, education, housing, income assistance, among other things, would have to be improved. Farming and city planning, among other things, would have to be rationalized to reduce energy consumption, GHG emissions, and other death-dealing pollutants. But that's still the tip of the iceberg. Our plan would urgently have to deal with replacing jobs and incomes lost to climate change effects and to mitigation efforts. It would have to deal just as urgently with how to ensure that the poorest and the hardest hit climate change victims locally and worldwide are given the extra help they need to lead decent lives. Mass migration caused by climate change or military conflicts would be a crucially important and, as we've seen, thorny problem to solve. And militarism itself, with its huge carbon footprint, will have to be given a hard look through the lens of benefit to people rather than benefit to corporations, as is most often the case now. Fundamentally, our climate plan would have to be organized around the crying need for us to transition with minimal delay to a post-carbon energy and economic system. Under current and foreseeable conditions, it's hard to imagine that this does not mean transitioning to a post-capitalism economic and social system, which means that there will likely be some considerable efforts by the existing capitalist power structure to resist any such transition, such transformation. In fact, as witnessed at Standing Rock and as threatened by Minister Carr, we're already seeing that resistance. So when we start discussing how to develop our transition plan, we will have to take state repression into consideration too. All this and probably much more that we can't suck out of our thumbs in 15 minutes will be necessary. And who will do it? Some of us who are already doing pieces of it. Has anyone noticed that I've shifted into dealing with tonight's second question? Linking struggles that we all face the same foes. If this seems to be a huge undertaking, it's only because it is. And there are indications that it's very doable. And what will more and more be the kicker in coming years, what choice do we have? The Paris Accord? When Trudeau took office and decided to break his promise to scrap the National Energy Board assessment of Kinder Morgan, the pacifier he offered us was the ministerial panel meetings, which held 3 or 4 dozen meetings along the pipeline route, heard many public interveners, received thousands of submissions, and made several limited but good recommendations that were ignored. Anyone who attended several hours of those meetings couldn't help but being impressed with the variety and range of knowledge that civic-minded citizens possess, whether scientists or engineers, or mill workers or backyard gardeners, and are willing to share. And that was only dealing with important, but a limited number of questions for a few days. Perhaps those who've attended a good trade union convention have had similar experience. I understand people who have been at World Social Forum gatherings are charged by the experience of so much knowledge, experience, and wisdom being shared. Back on the local level, getting started would take some effort. As Anne mentioned in her introductory remarks, the Vancouver Eco-Socialists have been kicking around the idea of a weekend teach-in to begin this process. Our initial thinking is that such a gathering would begin to discuss how we could spark a wider effort to begin developing the kind of transition plan I've been talking about. We've gotten some encouragement for the teach-in from the SFU Institute for the Humanities, but we need to pull together people similar to people in this room who already have too much to do, and start talking about topics, timetables, speakers, and groups of organizations we might involve in such a teach-in. My own fondest hope, after working in the trade union movement for 35 years, is that among many other things, we can get blue-collar union members and environmentalists sitting down together and working on solutions. In our first forum on the city of the site of struggle we held last January, veteran Vancouver municipal politician and activist Jean Swanson noted that getting struggles to link up is difficult. To get anything done, she said, on the basis of long experience, you kind of have to stay focused on just one or a few things, often for years. But the fact that she and a number of other activists from different struggles attended that forum, and the fact that you all, panelists and audience, have come here tonight, indicates that there's a consciousness of the need for linking up struggles, for cross-fertilizing our experiences, perhaps for initiating joint actions at some point. Let's see what the future brings.